I do not believe that Trunks has more potential than Gohan, and I say this at the beginning of the video because you're going to have idiots that are just going to look at the title and hop straight to the comment section to try and prove that I'm an idiot, even though I clearly said in the first 15 seconds that I don't think Trunks has more potential than Gohan. The argument for Trunks having more potential than Gohan is that he's accomplished the most out of arguably any character in Dragon Ball history with virtually little to no help. And the interesting thing about this is that when you analyze both versions of Trunks, both the present version and the future version, we come to one common conclusion, and this is the mere fact that neither of them ever really lived up to their full potential for completely different reasons. Let's start off with future Trunks. In his life, in particular, he grew up in a situation where the only person that could ever train him for the first 13-ish years of his life, so his life up to pretty much becoming a teenager, Gohan essentially trained him. And when you consider the fact that Gohan himself was already handicapped because of the fact that he was a kid that grew up in a tyrannical society, and as a result of that, Gohan never really got a lot of assistance, and all of the people that could have trained Gohan and pushed him into really reaching his full potential all got killed for different reasons. And when you look at what Trunks was in Dragon Ball Super, he was able to achieve Super Saiyan Rage, and we're not going to get into a deep power scaling debate between exactly how strong it is, because Dragon Ball Super's writing is inconsistent. There are times where Super Saiyan Rage looks stronger than Blue, there are times where it doesn't, but then at the very end, when he gets that Super Spirit Sword attack and slices Zamasu in half, he looks like he's the strongest character in Dragon Ball. But the point that we're getting at here is that Trunks displayed, even fighting, Zamasu and Goku Black as a Super Saiyan 2 for the earlier parts of the arc and holding his own at certain points, with very, very, very limited assistance and living in an entire universe solely by himself. He was able to get that strong with virtually nothing. And also another thing too, that's very important to point out, is that when future Gohan died, Trunks was essentially left by himself. And while he was left by himself, in 3 years with virtually no help at all, Trunks got as strong as future Gohan did in 3 years as a child by himself with no help. And when you look at the manga adaptation, it's actually even more concrete, because in the manga adaptation, you can actually see that Trunks was already a Super Saiyan before Gohan had died and was fighting as a Super Saiyan against a based form future Gohan with one arm, and that was basically a good training session. Gohan didn't obviously think that Trunks was, strong enough to fight at a Super Saiyan himself, so he was holding back significantly. And when you consider that monumental gap between fighting against a handicapped base Gohan to approximating his strength in 3 years by himself, that's an incredible feat that Trunks has. But when we compare this to the present version of Trunks, we get a completely different story. And the story is different for one major reason. The Trunks in the present timeline never lived up to his full potential because he never needed to. And because of the fact that the circumstances were never really in place for him to really have to bring out his full potential. So you have, on one hand, a future Trunks that was never able to live up to his full potential because he was always so handicapped in every way imaginable. And then on the other hand, you have a present version of Trunks that has everything in the world going for him to be way stronger than his future counterpart. But because he has everything, and because there's everybody else alive that's way stronger than him, he doesn't need to push himself the same exact way, and he could live a more normal Earthling type life. And because of this, we see a very interesting dynamic with both Trunkses where, for completely different reasons, neither of them were ever able to live up to their full potential. But focusing more on the present version of Trunks and comparing this to the present version of Gohan, the interesting thing is that the present version of Gohan was able to live up to his potential in certain pockets of time because he trained at certain particular points in time. And then we can see that we have an entire 7-year gap that takes place where Gohan doesn't train much. And as a result of this, or, some people are going to argue that he didn't train at all, but the point we're trying to get at here is that over the course of those 7 years, Gohan wasn't really training, and he was able to essentially, with using the old Kai's support, be able to fight against Super Buu, which is a ridiculous boost because it took Goku and Vegeta years of training to approximate the strength that Gohan had in the Cell games, And just with the flip of a switch, the Elder Kai could basically just bring all of Gohan's potential back to the point where Gohan was even stronger than he was back then, which is an incredible feat. And the interesting thing is that the present version of Gohan's potential is weird because his potential is already unlocked, but at the same time, he can never really fully live up to it because he doesn't really need to train. The present version of Gohan went through the proper writing mechanisms to put his character in a place where he doesn't actually need to train because he's done so many other things in the past that all he needs is a little warm up from Piccolo, and all he really needs is just some motivation, and that's all it takes to basically spark him into a brand new transformation that can dominate a significantly stronger foe. And when we compare this to the present version of Trunks, because he's a little kid, and because the show is simply just not focused on him, whereas in the future timeline everybody else died, so Trunks had to fight, especially after Gohan died because there was nobody else, both of them live in completely different circumstances. So the ultimate conclusion is that future Trunks got more of a star role because of the way that the story was written, and as a result of it, he got to live up to more of his potential, even though he had more of a handicap than the present version of Trunks, who had a significantly better lifestyle. But that's only because Trunks had to do that. And when you compare this to the present version of Trunks, had he had the intrinsic motivation to train and push himself the way that future Trunks did, there's no telling how strong the present version of Trunks would be, but we would never get a chance to actually know the answer to that question because of the fact that he will never do it because the timeline that he lives in is simply just too positive and it makes him a softer character. Now, as I was editing this video, I discovered a major comparison between the future version of Trunks and the present version of Gohan in the Room of Spirit and Time specifically. And in this case, it is that Gohan actually trained with Goku throughout the entirety of his Room of Spirit and Time session, whereas in the case of Trunks, if you look at the anime adaptation, it's pretty much shown directly that he never really trained with Vegeta at all, and he essentially just shared a room with Vegeta over the course of an entire year, where they basically were just surviving off of the same resources, but they were never actually directly training with each other. And this is extremely important because, once again, it also shows us and illustrates to us that Trunks is always a character that kinda has to figure things out by himself. Even when he's in a time chamber where he can push Vegeta and Vegeta can push him, he unfortunately gets the handicap that he never actually gets to directly train with his father, and as a result of it, he had weaknesses in his training and fighting that he didn't even realize. Had he trained with Vegeta, he would have known that Super Saiyan Grade 3 was not an effective form, and he could have worked with Vegeta to actually figure out a much more improved version of fighting the way that Gohan and Goku did, because they trained with each other, and as a result of it, because Gohan's a lot younger and more inexperienced, he gained a lot from Goku and didn't make the mistakes that Trunks would have. And because of the quality of training that Goku and Gohan had over the course of that 1 year, they never really needed to go back into the Room of Spirit and Time again because what they had already was sufficient. And we can see in the case of Trunks and Vegeta that they went back into the Room of Spirit and Time in the anime adaptation multiple times, and despite going in multiple times, they still never came out with more gains than what Goku and Gohan had in just one session. Now, the manga doesn't directly state that Vegeta and Trunks didn't train with each other the way the anime illustrated, but based off of the fact that Trunks was using his Super Saiyan Grade 3 form and felt confident that he could use it to defeat Cell, that clearly implies that they didn't train in the manga either, because it was implied that Vegeta could have used this form, but he didn't, and had they actually communicated throughout their training session, Trunks would have known this weakness all along. Now, as a post-edit, it's imperative that I mention something that I forgot to say earlier. And this is the fact that we have to also take into account that there are also different versions of Future Trunks. And to be specific, the first Future Trunks was the one that attempted to go to the unseen timeline. He came back, Cell killed him, hijacked his time machine, and created a whole bunch of timeline shenanigans that you didn't click on this video to know. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is that Trunks was never able to fully live up to his potential because he was simply oblivious to what was actually going on. He didn't know that Cell existed, and you can see that he was unfortunately a byproduct of just not having knowledge, which really shows the disadvantage that he has. And when you compare this to the other version of Future Trunks, which we know now in Dragon Ball Super because the Future Trunks from the second Future Trunks timeline, I know this sounds confusing, he essentially made a new timeline where there's essentially a duplicate version of himself that he's living with Mai now. That version of Future Trunks also doesn't know the pain and suffering that Trunks went through, and because history is being reset for him, he doesn't even realize that everything was going to go into a direction where everyone was going to get erased. And while some of you can argue and make a good argument that Trunks had the ability to train with the Supreme Kai, if you're looking at like the manga adaptation and he got a lot stronger, you have to understand that this came well into his adulthood, and you also have to factor in that pretty much everybody in Trunks' life besides Bulma at that point was already dead. And Babidi, for whatever reason in his timeline, just showed up way later than he was supposed to originally, because the original time that Babidi was supposed to show up was when Gohan was a lot younger. So Gohan would have actually been the one to have encountered them if they showed up on Earth at that time. So obviously, there was a discrepancy in the timing, but ultimately what we're trying to get at here is that if Trunks was able to even get a slither of this kind of training when he was younger, with a character like the present version of Trunks who has access to divine entities at a child's age, who knows what he would be able to do with that kind of opportunity. And in closing, just some food for thought, it's also important for us to mention that Goten in a lot of ways is kind of like a second Gohan, where you look at his life and you're like, wow, this is significantly greater than even the present version of Gohan, and definitely the future counterparts. But the thing about him is that even though he accomplished a lot of great feats at a very, very young age, as he got older and he never really had the desire to push himself the way that the stronger characters in Dragon Ball do, because the stronger characters in Dragon Ball know that if they die, it's a domino effect where the weaker characters wouldn't be strong enough to fight against whatever threat defeated them. Goten doesn't have to push himself, and as a result of this, the older version of Goten, even as Dragon Ball GT showed us, would never be able to live up to his potential, even the same way GT showed for Trunks, even if you say GT's not canon. And for those of you who want to write off Dragon Ball GT and say it's not canon, then fine. Let's just use the end of Dragon Ball Z, where both Goku and Vegeta were forcing Goten and Trunks to participate in the World Tournament because they thought their sons had gotten soft.